We're going to go now to the stage where Arlie Schardt, who was a correspondent for Time magazine in the 1960s and covered much of the civil rights movement, is going to give a speech.
Stand before the God of history. We will talk in terms of things we've done. Seems that I can hear the God of history saying, that was not enough.
I get the chills every time I see that wonderful scene of people marching and Dr. King speaking and the folks in the church singing. And like many of the journalists who were there for a long time, we still get together, those of us who are still here. This was 55 years ago, you know. And I think everybody agrees it was the high point of his or her life to have had the privilege of being in the South at that particular time. I thought I would do two things, two sort of blocks in my remarks. First of all, since I was asked to talk about covering the South, I'm going to talk a few snapshots of the way the journalists were working, how we worked at that time. And then secondly, and this may sound like I'm flipping it upside down, but go into a little more background of a couple of the major and sometimes lesser known events that took place during the movement. I would say, first of all, one of the stereotypes of media coverage at that time was that the media was always accused of bias, that we were all accused of favoring the civil rights movement and opposing the white Southern establishment. Well, that wasn't true at all. You did not have to be biased as a reporter to cover the civil rights movement in the South in the 60s. All you had to do was report the facts accurately and the facts about what was going on, and the story spoke for itself. I don't know of any journalist who at any time who was a reporter. I mean, a columnist is another thing. A columnist is free to write his or her opinion pieces and so on, but I don't know of any reporter who ever could be shown to do any inaccurate or slanted reporting. Second, it certainly can be said that the impact of the media was enormous. The television coverage in particular of Selma and Bloody Sunday at the Pettus Bridge, and you saw just a moment of that on the video there, in 1965, obviously ignited the entire country. People were horrified to see state troopers and local deputy sheriffs and so on with horses and billy clubs and smashing people down. You could have caught a glimpse there of John Lewis, who was at the head of the march, who just sent you his greetings a moment ago, and with whom I've been lucky enough to remain close friends since that time. A third factor that doesn't get much coverage but was a very interesting and helpful aspect for at that time for journalists was the courage of white Southerners. There were a number of people in almost all the communities where there were major civil rights activities taking place who were stepping out of the social constrictions that adhered at that time and risking their well-being as well. I knew several who eventually had to move, had to leave their homes and town and communities because they were accused of colluding with the civil rights movement. And so, in fact, I'd like to especially cite another aspect of that was that there were a number of white Southern civil rights lawyers, Charles Morgan Jr., from Montgomery, and Morris Dees, who is now the head of the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is dedicated to exposing bigotry as it continues today. Charles and his wife and their young son had to move out of Montgomery, when there were bomb threats against their house and threats to kidnap their son and so on. And they literally had to leave the city. A fourth element was that from the start, in terms of the climate that took place at the time of the movement, the climate for journalists, most of the time, I think most of us felt like we could cover this story in a pretty normal, traditional way, but the overlying or underlying, whichever you want to call it, sense was also a sense of fear. It wasn't just a fear of the Klan types, who quite often did intimidate or beat up a reporter, but more so it was fear of the police. And that ranged from state troopers in Alabama and Mississippi to local sheriffs and deputies like those in Neshoba County, Mississippi. That's the home of Philadelphia, Mississippi, where Cecil Price, the deputy sheriff, and his colleagues organized and executed the murder of 3 civil rights workers in one of the more highly publicized and infamous chapters of the movement. Another aspect of the coverage in terms of working there as a journalist was that one of the things we did in the more dangerous areas, if you were out in really rural areas and you were pursuing a story, that was quite risky. And what we often did was we would double up different reporters. It didn't matter whether one guy was from Time and somebody else was from Newsweek or the New York Times or the Los Angeles Times or the United Press, whatever. We would room together just as kind of a safety measure that you had at least somebody to check in with. And if somebody was not calling in or showing up to meet for supper or something like that, there was a system where we would relay that information to the home office of that reporter, and a lot of calls would go out and people would start looking until they found whoever it was that apparently had been missing for a while. Then a couple of other memories, and for example, another thing, I remember when I was just there and really a rookie at that type of event in journalism, and I was rooming with a wonderful United Press International reporter named Nick Chris, who had been on the beat for quite a few years, and he was a very low-key, tremendously hard-working, hard-digging reporter, and we were doing a story in Americus, Georgia. This was before Selma, before Philadelphia, Mississippi, about the time of Birmingham in 63 or 64. And we went back to our motel after having done a lot of our reporting for the day, and Nick took the dresser, the bureau, and shoved it over in front of the door. And I said, "What are you doing that for?" He said, "You'll learn." And so that was one little protective device. Another generally unheralded aspect of journalism at that time was that even in the South, there were white journalists, and at that time, and still too much today all over the country, journalism was way too dominated by whites. It is too dominated by white people today, but at that time, of course, there weren't any black journalists. But in Selma, Alabama, the local paper there and the local reporter were terrific. I never could figure out how they survived, why their offices weren't bombed, because there was such tremendous community pressure to diminish the recognition of what was going on, the awareness of what was going on, and certainly to keep that information from getting outside the relatively narrow confines of Selma. But day after day, they would run banner headlines about things that were going on that were really embarrassing. The behavior of Sheriff Jim Clark, who traveled all over town with his electric billy clubs. He would arrest a whole bunch of school kids and put them in line, marching them off to a temporary detention center and whacking them with his electric billy club. And that kind of thing got covered in the Selma Times Journal, so it was quite something. And then, of course, the role of young people, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with, was absolutely awesome. It was amazing to see kids, 14, 15, 13, 16, black and white, from, in the beginning, mainly from the areas in which the work was going on, but later, of course, it became a national phenomenon. But the idealism of those young people to come out and to come together and take the terrific risks that they were in much more risk than I was ever as a journalist, because they were right out there on the street and they were defying the police. And there's no telling what the police were going to do, and yet these kids just kept on doing it. One day, a quick example of how the system worked. I'll go back to America's Georgia again, and the reason we went, Nick and I went to cover that. I don't think there are any other reporters there, and I don't even remember how I heard what was going on. But I guess somebody called me with a phone call in the office or something. But anyway, it turned out that a large number of black school kids, mainly in their early teens, had decided to picket the local movie theater because it only allowed blacks to sit up in the balcony, and they wanted to establish their right to sit anywhere they wanted, which was definitely, so this must have been '64, because the Public Accommodations Act would have been signed by Lyndon Johnson by that time. So the kids were picketing back and forth. I remember that it was noon, and they were walking in twos, going back and forth in front of the theater, very quietly, just saying, I don't remember what the signs were. We want our rights, or something like that. And while they're picketing, the town council rushes into a meeting, and they pass a law saying that in order to picket in a public location, the picketers must be marching 2 by 2, and they must be exactly 3 feet between each pair of picketers. So the kids were breaking the law, which nobody even knew about because it had just been passed during the lunch hour, and they were hauled off out of town to a horrible abandoned concrete slab of an old prison, cement walls and open air bars, and toilet facilities were practically non-existent, and they were kept in there for a couple of days. And I remember going out there when we heard about what had happened, and a very wonderful young SNCC photographer, a Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee photographer, Danny Lyons, who went on to become a very famous photographer. And I went, and Danny stood up on my shoulders and got pictures looking into the where all these kids were sprawled out on this cold cement floor. And he got those photos out to the wire services, after which the kids were quickly released and allowed to go home. But anyway, that was the kind of way, that was kind of what we saw in many manifestations going on all the time. Another aspect that needs to be mentioned is the work of two aspects of the federal government. One was probably one regarded by, I know, almost everybody who had anything to do with the movement, was federal Judge Frank Johnson in Montgomery, Alabama, who ironically at the University of Alabama Law School, his roommate was George Wallace, who I don't need to tell you about George Wallace. Anyway, Judge Johnson was a very tall, stern-looking man with little bifocals that came down over his nose like that, and he issued a series of rulings through the period of the middle 60s, which were one setback after another for the segregationists, with one result being that his mother's home in Montgomery was blown up. Luckily, she was in another room when it was done at night outside her bedroom, but thank heaven she wasn't in her bedroom at that time. And then later, because Judge Johnson's son, Johnny, young, wonderful, young, rambunctious teenager, a great musician, he had a little rock band in which he was the drummer, committed suicide. He was just so harassed day after day after day at school that obviously it had a terrible effect on him. And one night, Judge Johnson was coming home for dinner and he saw Johnny running in the front door, and the judge went to the front door and it was locked. Johnny had locked the door and he knew something was very wrong, and he ran around to the side, and before he got into the kitchen door he heard a shot, and Johnny was gone. But Judge Johnson continued to stand up for the law of all things in one decision after another. It was he who made the ruling that enabled the Selma March, the march from Selma to Montgomery during the voting rights drive to take place. And there's a neat little anecdote that took place. There was a long court hearing challenging the right of the marchers to make the march to Montgomery. This was after they had all been brutalized in the initial attempt to march to Montgomery. And Judge Johnson wore, I don't have the right glasses here, but he wore spectacles that were down over his eyes like this. And he was sat on a very high bench. And the attorney for George Wallace, for Governor Wallace, who was trying to prevent the march, made some semi-obscene remark about Dr. King, who was also on the witness panel and was going to testify. And so Judge Johnson looked down at this guy from about where I am down to where you're sitting, was about the perspective. And he said to the lawyer, he said, "I will remind you that Dr. King and all other witnesses are members of this court for the purposes of this hearing, and there will be no further remarks," or something like that. And the guy looks up and he says, "I'm trying, Your Honor, I'm trying. And Johnson looks down and he says, "Well, try a little harder." And the guy just turned into butter. So that was where it was fun to be a journalist at a time like that. And then there were also, as I mentioned, lawyers like Chuck Morgan and Morris Dees, who were another part of the movement that you don't hear a lot about. But in Chuck's case in particular, who he later argued for the ACLU, the Supreme Court decision that brought about the one-man, one-vote ruling, which was brought about a massive change, of course, right there. That set the framework for what was to follow in the Voting Rights Act. Anyway, Chuck had his office in Atlanta. He's the one whose home was was threatened to be bombed in Birmingham, and his family went to Washington, and then he was offered the job by the ACLU to open a southern office, and they moved to Atlanta. And Chuck became an incredible source for every journalist who some of them, like myself and 7 or 8 others, were my colleague Roger Williams in the Atlanta Bureau, and 3 or 4 reporters from Newsweek and New York Times and Los Angeles Times, several others, were based full-time there. But a lot of reporters began coming down from their northern offices to spend a week or two doing a series of stories. And the first stop was always at the office of Chuck Morgan in Atlanta, because he knew everything, he knew everybody. He took them out. He drank 3 double martinis at noon, and I don't know how he kept anything straight, because that would have killed me. But anyway, he was a great source for the journalists, and letting them know who are the people you want to talk to if you're going to go to Grenada, Mississippi, or if you're going to go to Birmingham, or if you're going to go to Jackson, Mississippi, or whatever. And he could connect them with other lawyers that were working in the civil rights movement in those communities and so on. So that was another aspect of how we went about our work. I think that, and then there was the last element that I don't think gets very much coverage, and that was the role of the United States Justice Department Civil Rights Division, in which a man named John Doerr became an iconic figure in the movement, time after time, standing between, literally preventing riots from taking place between mobs of white segregationists and civil rights demonstrators right out in broad daylight. He probably worked an 18-hour day almost for years down there, because everything that the movement tried to do was challenged immediately by the segregationist government, local or state, in whatever state a major event was taking place. And John Doerr just worked night and day. He was pretty much regarded as a hero to everybody on the good side of the equation, and he is still living and still being honored by everybody who was a part of the movement at that time. And then I'd say that another key thing, and this is not involving the journalists, but a key factor throughout the whole movement from the time that Dr. King emerged as the leading voice was Dr. King's and his colleagues' insistence on nonviolence. Without it, the movement would never have succeeded, because if the demonstrators or the protesters, or whatever you want to call them, had tried to strike back with violence, that would have, quote, justified the assertions of the segregationist forces that were the power structure at that time. And it took tremendous discipline. There were many, many workshops beginning way back in University of Miami of Ohio, when they were preparing for Freedom Summer in 1964, all the way through great workshops that were held particularly by a man named Reverend James Lawson in Memphis, Tennessee, where there was a lot of role playing, where young people who were preparing to go to some dangerous site where some aspect of the voting rights drive was going to begin, would get training where they would practice being harassed and roughed up and spat on and kicked and everything like that, and still learning to control their temper and not strike back. And that was their secret weapon, I guess you'd call it. One last aspect of sort of the mechanics of covering the movement was that early on, way before I got there, or before there was much, if any, national coverage of the movement or of conditions in the South in the period from, I would say, 1955 to 1961 or 62, the New York Times had a reporter there named Claude Sitton, S-I-T-T-O-N, who is a journalistic legend. And one of the things for which he'll always be remembered is that, of course, when we were out doing a story or later summarizing our coverage or taking notes to get ready to write our stories, we would take a notebook like this. I would take some notes on scraps of paper and stuff like that, but I would also stand off on the side or go off by myself for a few minutes and write down a lot of notes. but this was kind of unwieldy, and of course it immediately identified you as a reporter, and more than once myself, and I know it happened to other people too, would get spotted by some white person who would scream out, "Hey, that man over there is taking notes, you gotta stop that," and there'd be a bunch of people running after us, and we'd have to, I guess, run for our lives. I mean, we were running. I don't know what would have happened if I ever got caught. I was a pretty good runner in those days. I was a tennis player and stuff. But anyway, Claude went to the outfit that makes these steno notebook, it was called, and he had them design one like this, much smaller, which you could put into your coat pocket and then slip off and do your notes once in a while. But and you know, in a way, I got to say, maybe we were kidding ourselves, because a lot of the time we were wearing a jacket and tie, and not many other people were, so it probably wasn't too hard to figure out that we were reporters. But at least if you weren't seen conspicuously taking notes, that was at least a little bit of a safety valve. I think I had one other note before, another quick video here. No, I think Claude's little episode was what I wanted to mention, but at this point, I want to segue into a little, again, I told you I was flipping this thing upside down. So those were sort of some of the mechanics that were our everyday way of life. But I'd like to go into a little bit of the history that set the stage for the stories that all of you I know I hope are familiar with. And so there's one little more segment. If you could run that one right now, that would be great. This is set in the Alabama Black Belt.
For 100 years after the end of slavery, black citizens in the South struggled to survive in a system of state-sanctioned segregation and discrimination.
I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
It would take massive protests of black citizens to crack the wall of Southern white resistance. And it would take court decisions and strong federal laws, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, to provide the tools that would force change. March 1965. Before the Voting Rights Act was passed, 600 peaceful demonstrators tried to march from Selma, Alabama to the state capitol in Montgomery to petition for the right to vote. At the Edmund Pettus Bridge, state and local police attacked the marchers, driving them back. Dr. Martin Luther King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference filed a federal lawsuit to affirm the constitutional right of citizens to march and to petition their grievances to the state.
America was founded on the principle that all men are created equal.
Federal Judge Frank Johnson, Jr. ruled on the lawsuit.
Judge Johnson has just ruled that we have a legal and constitutional right to march from Selma to Montgomery.
25,000 people, black and white, came to Alabama for the new march. Because Judge Johnson's ruling authorized the U.S. Department of Justice to ensure that the march was not obstructed, the Civil Rights Division played a major role in mobilizing federal protective forces.
How long? Not long. It's long, but it's been short suffering.
Yes, sir.
The storm is passing over. Hallelujah.
43-year-old Viola Liuzzo never made it home.
Wow. So I, in a way, I want to take it back to at least how I experienced things like that. John Lewis and Julian and Bond and I have remained the closest of friends ever since. You saw in that video John being smashed to the pavement, and one of the things that really demonstrated the enormous bravery, courage, power, dedication of John was that when he was knocked down there, they clubbed the daylights out of him, and he was hospitalized for several days while negotiations were going on to try to get legal permission to go on the next march. And I was at probably about 3 days after Bloody Sunday at the Pettus Bridge outside of Selma, where John was so brutally beaten. I was standing on the steps of the Browns Chapel Church in Selma, which was the headquarters, as it were, of the movement. It was where Dr. King preached many times, and where a lot of that's where Dr. King held a sort of a summit meeting with Malcolm X at one point, and a lot of other major events took place at that church. And it was the place where people went to find out what's going on, what's going to happen next, what's the plan. And it was a kind of a snowy, late February, early March morning. And all of a sudden, there's John in the same tan trench coat that he had been wearing when he was smashed up. And his head was covered with a bandage that was like a football helmet. I mean, it was really thick and really heavy. And I said, John, what are you doing here? I was afraid he'd get dizzy and fall down the steps. But instead, he made a speech. There were a lot of people milling around, and everybody suddenly became aware, my God, that's John Lewis. He's supposed to be in the hospital. And instead, John started talking about we're not giving up, and we're going to continue operating in a nonviolent manner, and we are going to bring about passage of a Voting Rights Act. And as you well know, ultimately that's what they did. But anyway, when I got there, it was a couple years before that, and I was just a 29-year-old white guy from Wisconsin, and I had competed in sports and had lived in California and New York City, and I had the thrill of covering the Rome Olympics for Sports Illustrated magazine with a team of SI staffers. So when I transferred, when I got myself assigned instead of Time magazine, I'd at least seen something of the world. And yet I wonder to this day how it could be possible that myself and millions and millions and millions of my fellow Americans actually knew so little about the nation that we were living in. And I'm not speaking just for myself. I know that that's something that a lot of the folks, the journalists from the North, had said to themselves and to each other. And I finally got the assignment I wanted, which was to the Atlanta Bureau, which was responsible for the 7 southern states. And it was almost like moving to another planet. In the months ahead, I saw in America that very few of us outside the South had any idea even existed. It was an American apartheid. Every aspect of life was controlled by white people. The schools were segregated. Blacks were consigned to schools that got only a fraction of the resources that were allocated to white schools, and very few blacks could even hope to gain an education beyond high school, and almost no Southern blacks could vote. Just a very, very few had achieved the right to vote. And most only had menial jobs. They worked as farmers or semi-skilled laborers. Very few owned any land, and a lot of the blacks who did own some land that they had acquired, that their ancestors had received after the Civil War, lost that land to whites who cheated them out of the ownership of that land by working in close collusion with the local government. I wrote about one really notorious case in South Carolina where thousands of acres of what is now really, really priceless acreage were stolen from their black owners, and I can go into the details of that sometime. But anyway, and any blacks who got out of line were quickly put in their place either by firing them or evicting them from their homes or threatening them with the police. And as I said earlier, the main job of the police was simply to sustain segregation, and that was the legacy of slavery, of course. And then that ended officially, and let me underline officially, because there's a official reality, and then there's a legal reality, and then there's a real reality. But legally and officially, that kind of segregationist behavior was outlawed by the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, where legally segregation was declared illegal. But as you know, resistance was massive, and it was soon after that Brown versus Board decision that an NAACP activist named Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a public bus on December 1st, 1955 in Montgomery, Alabama, and you know the rest. You've been enjoying tremendous wealth of knowledge today about the impact of what she did and what she set in motion, among other things, bringing about the beginning of a mass movement that pretty much was known as the foot soldiers of the Freedom Army. And their efforts really gained momentum when a young minister named Martin Luther King, who was 26 years old at the time, came to Montgomery and helped launch the movement that really destroyed segregation. And again, it was Dr. King who began immediately pressing on people the importance of nonviolence. It was that discipline that baffled and frustrated and infuriated their tormentors. Many demonstrators, as you know, were horribly beaten and badly injured, and a lot of civil rights workers were killed especially during the 60s, but some also, as you know, it took place before that. But despite constantly being urged to hit back, they never did, and that gave them the moral high ground, and the campaign followed campaign, and on we went. And I'm going to skip a little bit of this because I've already kind of touched on the Civil Rights Acts that President Johnson signed. And by the way, that was a very brilliant legislative maneuvering on the part of LBJ. You might know, or you might recall, that one night after the attack on the marchers on the Pettus Bridge that you saw there, President Johnson decided to make a national television address because those scenes were seen on national television the next day all over the country, over and over on every broadcast. And in those days, happily, television covered a lot more news than they did before it kind of became People magazine the way we have today. But LBJ went on the air and gave a speech about the outrageousness of what had happened, and he said that the key to equality and to equal rights was the passage of the Voting Rights Act, and he looked right into the camera and he said, "And we shall overcome." And when he said that, after he gave the speech, he went back into his office, and Bill Moyers at that time was his press secretary. Bill Moyers, who does these wonderful political programs on public television now. He went into Moyers' office and he said, "Well, Bill, I guess you know we just lost the South." And it was true, they did. The South went Republican almost overnight, and it's still Republican to this day. But anyway, when Dr. King came to Montgomery, things were still not really in full motion, and everybody began to realize that something really, really big had to happen. And while the SNCC workers understandably felt a sense of ownership in the Selma issue, because they were the ones who'd been working there for months, unheralded, basically unreported on, and taking many, many beatings and risking their lives every single day and night, it became clear that the need for some higher profile was needed, and that turned out to be Dr. King, who emerged as the leader. And Dr. King recognized that if American citizens outside the South were made aware of the brutality of racism, and as I say, few Americans, including myself, a northern guy, were aware of it. Anyway, if they were made aware of it, they would want to end it. And so something really dramatic had to be done. And so weeks of planning went into the Selma campaign. I remember I went there several weeks before the actual program, as it were, began, because I wanted to meet the police chief, I wanted to meet the sheriff, I wanted to meet the newspaper editor, I wanted to meet the business people and stuff like that, get an idea of what was going on in Selma. And of course, King and the movement had announced that they were going to use Selma as the place from which they were going to launch a national voter rights drive. So anyway, I was there for a couple of weeks, and then in January of 1965, Dr. King, there was a widely publicized event to kick off the drive in which Dr. King came to the Hotel Albert in Selma, a beautiful old hotel modeled after the Doge's Palace in Venice, of all things. And he was going to affirm the right of a black person to stay in a public hotel. And there was a very large crowd of media and other spectators mobbing the lobby. I happened to be standing right behind Dr. King as he went to the front desk to sign the registration form, and lo and behold, some white guy bursts through the crowd. He almost knocked me over, jumps up and starts beating on Dr. King. And the guy was quickly subdued by other people who were in the crowd there, but that was the launch, and that kind of set the tone. And those pictures went national, so day one was pretty much of a success, with Dr. King getting roughed up a little bit, and it made very good television, and people began to see what was going on. And of course, weeks later, that was going to culminate in the March on Selma. And then, so during those many, many weeks after that first moment where Dr. King signed in at the Hotel Albert, I'd like to share just a couple of things again about covering the movement. One of the things that happened night after night was that Dr. King would go to...
You've been watching coverage of the National Day of Courage, a celebration of the 100th anniversary of Rosa Parks' birth. Thanks to our partners, to Henry Ford, and everyone who joined us here today. 1955 was a long time ago, and this nation has experienced eons of social progress since then. That's the definition of American exceptionalism, this nation's never-ending quest to better itself and better its citizens in search of a more perfect union. The struggle's not over, by far, but on days like today, when we look back at what a seamstress did on a public bus just to have a seat, it's worth noting the tremendous progress that ensued and continues to develop. And what it asks from all of us can be summed in a single word: courage. Stay part of the conversation and tell us what you have the courage to do. Find us on Twitter and on Facebook at The Henry Ford. For all of us at Detroit Public Television and The Henry Ford, we hope you've enjoyed a National Day of Courage. Stay with me. The broadcast continues right now online at dayofcourage.org. I'm Stephen Henderson. Take care.